Okay, welcome to our talk. I'm really happy to introduce Katerina Sidorova's new project, As a Pile of Ash, that launches today on 16nicholsonstreet.org. So this is a culmination of a long project that we started about a year ago right now. We all have worked and contributed to the exhibition in different capacities. So today we'll be joined by Katerina Sidorova, the artist herself, Isabella Shields, today as the editor of our publication, Nell Cardozo with her poem The Three Graces, and our guest speaker, Oksana Zapletina, based in St. Petersburg, presenting a contemporary sociological perspective. So my name is Aga Paulina Mlynczak, and I am one of the directors at 16 Nicholson Street, alongside Nell and Isabella. And tonight I'll be wearing my curator and moderator hats. So before we start, just a few technical information. So we'll be recording this session and it will be available later on our YouTube channel. And then in order to experience the presentation in the best possible way, you will have to switch to the side-by-side view, which you'll find in the top right corner of your Zoom. It's probably already switched on, so I wouldn't worry if you see the presentation. That means it's on. And also keep your mics on mute. And after all the talks, we'll have a Q&A and a panel discussion. So you can ask questions in the chat and we'll try and answer as many as possible. So I'm really proud and happy to introduce the project that started as an idea about performativity and state control. And then it became an artistic inquiry into power and its relationship to responsibility. The work has been released in many parts. So at first as an exhibition in 2019, then comes the second iteration, the virtual exhibition that commences today on 16 Nicholson Street website, alongside the VR performance and the publication. So we are gathered here today to kind of make sense of all the components and tell you what we have found in the process of making them. So here I'll kind of take a quick second to give thanks to Bart Urbański for providing the photographic documentation of the installation, Thomas Dixon for the documentation shots of the performance as well as marketing, and Kerr Thomson for production management of this event. So, who's Katerina Sidorova? I met Katerina about 2 years ago, and about a year ago I became the curator on As a Pile of Ash, and making the exhibition virtual became a necessity. And it was a huge artistic and curatorial challenge as well. So creating a show under pandemic has shifted my focus from the traditional idea of curating as caretaking or as fostering to a more drastic type of control and direction. So we were approaching total gaze control, which is a requirement imposed by the nature of online, the online framework, as well as any audiovisual media, in fact. So our work was to adapt the physical installation to the website, to the online framework, and in fact it has gone beyond adaptation. We have achieved a transmediation of the artwork that has its own unique qualities and became a virtual experience in its own right. By this I mean that now the full experience can only be mediated through the virtual platforms, and I consider that our big success. The extreme control of the audience's gaze was made possible with technology, We used both 360 cameras and traditional photographic documentation. And this resulted in a strictly controlled virtual environment. This curatorial approach has become a strange variation on Foucault's concept of hierarchical observation. So me and Katerina created something kind of close to like an obsessive framing of access, which is very much in line with the topics we investigated throughout our development process, namely the state control and power and class structures. So with this project, as with any or many others, the interesting part is the story of origin. And obviously Katerina will have a lot to say here, but because it's already a second iteration of that exhibition. But from my personal point of view, there were 3 events that took place in the past year that influenced my way of looking at Katerina's work, as well as on my own curatorial practice. So the first one is, of course, the pandemic. Then I will talk about the anti-abortion movements, as well as us, our gallery becoming a more formalized entity. So the pandemic, which touched everyone everywhere, connected people across borders in like a swooping cross-national circle of grief and perseverance, and as well as like conflicting feelings around the annoyance at the rules, as well as fear of them not being enough to protect us. Well, while as a pile of ash started before the lockdown, but the oppressive political tendency that caused the public uproar surrounding social injustice. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, so yeah, to be precise, as a pile of ash started before the lockdown, but so did the oppressive tendencies that caused the public uproar surrounding social injustice that took momentum over the course of 2020 and 2021. The idea of state emergency powers came to the fore in several countries, causing them to perpetuate centralization of power and erasure of unruly populations. Already targets of police brutality and violence, the minority groups were put at an even more risk across the globe. Katerina's use of Dostoevsky's account of a public mock execution interrogates methods of legitimizing and consolidating power in Tsarist Russia, as well as right now. This way, she assembled a sort of conceptual directory for authoritarian gestures, which you may think of as an expanded performance script. I think that this study sheds light on the events of the day in an interesting way. The second important event in my recent life was entering a curatorial collaborative between myself, Nell, Cardozo, and Isabella Shields. Together, we aimed to create a gallery with essentially feminist core values. And I see Katerina's project as a rare, fundamentally feminist historical piece. It is an artwork which describes right now using back then as color palette and vice versa. So it is a work where a woman dares to edit and feminize words of a seminal male literary genius like Dostoevsky by literally dyeing the masculine historical lens pink and red. So remarkably, she still manages to let the work follow the classical trope of Eastern homage to the destitution of the just spirit, which Dostoevsky represents. And finally, early this year, I saw my Polish mom come out on the streets waving a pro-abortion flag, which I thought I'd never see. Not because my mom is a bigot, she isn't, but because I did not expect the Polish government to take an authoritarian populist turn so severe that some city councils would feel in their right to declare themselves LGBTQ-free zones. A situation which one may say arose due to governmental techniques of consolidating power, misinformation, and manipulation. By making this show virtual, we're aiming to reach as many people as possible by means as democratic as possible, which became a priority for us due to the fragility of democracy that becomes more and more apparent. So that is my introduction and all the things I see in Katerina's work. And now we'll hear from Katerina herself, who will talk about her piece as well as symbolism in Russian culture. Over to you, Kat.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you everyone for stopping by, even though it's as surreal as it can be via the social media. And thank you most of all, Aga, Nell, and Isabella, not just for, you know, the very amazing things that you have given me, like the platform to speak, the platform to discuss these things, but mainly for the amazing conversations we had this year. As Aga briefly mentioned, this is the second time this work is shown. First time it was shown in 2019, and it clearly feels like it was a different world. I'll try to, first of all, set the timer because I could speak forever. But I'll try to fill in as many gaps as it's possible with what you're going to see through the online presentation and what has been happening in Russia, in Europe, in America, in Eastern Europe specifically, and what has been happening, in my head, in my heart, observing this. 2019 was a rather harsh year for Russia, but more and more so, I see very similar tendencies of power abuse in governments that are becoming rapidly more and more right-wing, and the same theatricality and absurdity that is coming into place when the democracy is failing its citizens. And for this matter, I would like to start with my initial, I wouldn't say inspiration, but more drive for this project. In my practice, quite often I deal with the matters of mortality, and that goes way beyond mortality of just humans. I speak about non-human species. I speak about digital media and try to investigate what death can be as a life-defining factor. But coming across the historical documents of Dostoevsky, of which I'll speak in greater detail, of course, because it's very Russian literature specific and it's part of my DNA, and I'm really, really happy to share it here today. So for me, having that interest in mortality as a core, coming across the evidence of such a strange event as a mock execution. So an execution where the ones taking control know that this is a mere play, nobody will be murdered, but still go ahead with staging capital punishment for whatever reasons, usually for propaganda, performative reasons. That was interesting mainly from the perspective of the ones that are to be executed, to know the exact hour and minute of when your life would be ended and not by your will. So it's a direct opposition to what's taken, you know, control and dignity of your death in case of euthanasia can be. This is complete loss of dignity, of humanity, and being forced to face with one's own mortality. That was the initial interest when researching Dostoevsky's writings, Dostoevsky's biographical writings. But soon enough, after I started this project, so many things were happening in Russia. At the time, I was in Glasgow studying for my master's, and I could only access the events at home. And the events I'm talking about are numerous demonstrations against unjust political persecution of journalists, of activists, of public figures daring to not agree with the reigning regime. I could only access those events online. I had to search for my sources, and each time the viewing point for me was rather limited. And as passionate as I was, and I still am, about the events at home, my access to it was limited to what I could find, to what was given to me, to what was staged in a sense. And that became a very strong core of what me and Aga were trying to do with this presentation. I wouldn't say that we were using the pandemic and the limited access to physical spaces to our advantage, not at all. It wasn't like that. But we knew what we are working with, and with open minds, we were trying to explore this world of limited physical access, limited physical presence, and on the contrary, free access in the digital space. And that we are talking in Europe, in terms of European countries, in terms of Western countries, to put it broader, because what's happening at home is very different. So that is a very long introduction to the driving point behind this. I am noticing that I'm not yet changing the slides, but I will slowly. So then, just before explaining a bit more who were Petra Chavists, what kind of club was Dostoevsky involved in his youth, I would like to mention one crucial point is, again, as you can imagine me scrolling through liberal internet sources from my home in Glasgow, what I was noticing in the events of Russia was their specific performativity, theatricality, absurdity, and nothing was making sense. People were arrested for very absurd things. You could be arrested for reposting an image of a rainbow. You could be in a court case for drugs where the evidence would be photographs of apartment that is not yours. And I couldn't make sense of it. It's laughable almost, that level of absurdity and detachment from reality I was experiencing in my sad research. So from that, I would like to draw a very rough historical parallel to what was happening in mid-19th century with Dostoevsky and Petra Chavists. Very broadly, I'm describing it in the book that we worked on together with mainly Isabella, but also Nell and Aga. Again, I can credit you all night, and I will not stop doing so. So what has happened, and that's as brief as possible, yet as detailed as possible, with Dostoevsky is in his mid to late 20s, he was attending a reading club of a house, in a house of a young doctor called Petrashevsky. It was a very elite club of mainly young men, not mainly solely young men, educated, noble, rich, where they would discuss possibilities for Russia, which at the time was obviously a monarchy. There was still serfdom, so we had our peasants not free. They were enslaved by their own nation. We had extreme domain of Christianity, tightly linked to the state. It was secular at the time, but the influence of Christianity was insane, and we had unlimited power of the Tsar. Just 20 years ago, before that, when Tsar at the time, Nikolai I, was crowned, there was a big uprising of the Decembrists. That's probably a name that English-speaking audience will know better because of that terrible indie band that existed some time ago. Decembrists attempted a military uprising, and 5 of them were hung. They were executed in a fortress without the public eye. What happened to Petra Chavists after a few years of meeting, discussing, of potentially proposing ideas for a new Russia, but never really making a statement or a move or a plan, and mainly just reading literature that was a bit edgy, a bit on a dangerous side. One police agent was infiltrated in the group, and one day when Dostoevsky read out loud a letter to Belinsky, who was a liberal thinker in exile, very pro-West, pro-Europe, to great Russian writer Gogol, accusing him of being a hypocrite, of not following with the ideals he was describing in his books, and criticizing merely monarchy, serfdom, and domain of Christianity, the reign of Christianity. For that one letter being read out loud and met with applause, 27 members of the Petrushevsky's club were sentenced to death penalty, only to find out later on that this was all a mere play. Why did that happen was very clear, was to send message to the liberal youth, because it would only be the liberal youth who would follow what such a privileged niche club would be doing. The execution took place on 22nd of December of 1849. Some of the officers, and you can imagine the officers would be close friends of Petrashevists because they're all the elite of St. Petersburg. They could know, they could guess that there would be an amnesty. So one of the Petrashevists knew, but for the most of the events of that day, the execution site was staged perfectly. There was nothing that would not make one think of inevitability of death. There was a scaffold, there were the 3 poles where the first 3 to be shot by the officers were tied to. They were given special clothing, again, very vivid in a sense, very theatrical, very symbolic. They were given the white robes. Some try to speculate that they also had the white hoods on, but I doubt that. I'm showing you a picture of Dostoevsky himself later on. This is the image I'm talking about. There was no photographic evidence, of course, and there was no sketch made at the time. So what we're looking at right now is a drawing from the 80s of the 20th century, where you could see some of the victims have the hood on, and Petrashevsky himself, you could imagine that it was him, doesn't have the hood on. It's all speculation. Again, the access of information and defining what is actually true and what was imagined is really vague. This is the site of how it looks right now. That's a square in St. Petersburg. But recreating that feeling of total loss of personal control, total loss of personal boundaries, loss of the control of one's body, it was there, and it was performed brilliantly. Similar things are happening in contemporary Russia. It's not the same thing. Of course, it's not. It's a different regime. It's a different country right now. But the means of using theater are still there. And when we were working on the exhibition with Aga, keeping that staging and restriction of one's view became the crucial point. And I'm very grateful for her knowledge of, well, newfound knowledge of new media, where we could really direct the gaze of the viewer, just like the gaze of the convict on the day of the execution was directed. And I'm saying it not by guessing. Of course, what's so interesting as well about this case is most of this liberal youth, they were writers, poets, culture workers, otherwise. There is quite a rich archive of notes, diaries, and especially fiction writing by Dostoevsky. He mentions this event, although framed by French execution, in Idiot. And there he talks about his stare, where he would look at, where he knew that he has this life, 5 last minutes, and he would only look at the reflection of sun in a golden church dome. And you can imagine this onion Russian dome of an Orthodox Christian church, or at the sky, or at his close friends, his comrades. So this absolute loss of control was there, and that's what we are experiencing in a sense today. And I guess I can talk about that more in questions. The image you're looking at now is, again, not real, it's a film still from the star of a glorious happiness. That would be the direct translation. And I put it in there just because it would be strange not to mention any women that were involved. Indeed, we're talking about, and I will repeat myself again, an elitist boy club, almost a harmless elitist boy club. Of course, Dostoevsky was in it, and his experience later on in his exile in Siberia made him the great writer that he is and who I adore. But still, it was an elite group, and there is no evidence of women being involved in the reading. But once the execution was of the books, prison sentence followed. The Chavists was sent to Siberia, where they were met by what we now call Decembrist wives. That's a very derogatory term, but the Decembrists that I've mentioned previously, those who were not killed, and it was hundreds of them, if I'm not too wrong, they were sent to Siberia for a lifetime, and many of the wives followed. And the role of women in exile was incredible. They were the centers of the centers of cultural life in Siberia. They were meeting points. They were helping new political victims. And that's what we are seeing now in Belarus, where cis men fail to make political decisions. Women come on stage, and they come and appear strongly. They speak boldly, and they fight for their rights. In that situation, when the young Chavists were sent to Siberia, they were met by these wonderful women, and their presence should be mentioned more often. So it was there. Unfortunately, in history books, it still is a fight that we have to have. Then again, some film stills to define that theatricality, and still from Boris Godunov. Let's not skip. And what's happening now, and again, we can talk about it in the question section, is the image of a square, and in our case, also a courtroom with limited access to public space. What we Russians are facing are often images of courtrooms, documentation of another fake trial, another complete mock, ridiculous sentence. So the square and the courtroom become almost stages for a discussion on what democracy is, what civil society is, and how can resistance be possible. And before I drift too far, I want to speak, of course, of the resistance itself. What I mentioned in the very beginning was this extreme absurdity, not just a theater, but a circus, in fact. And that brings us to an amazing Russian writer who was, just like Foucault, researching the medieval times. His name is Bakhtin. I think he's more famous abroad than in Russia, actually. So he was describing the carnival, the laughs, the vulgar humor. And when resistance is hard, that's what people are left with. The language, the jokes, the very witty jokes, the discussions are there. And that carnival, it is happening in our political space right now. And that resistance of a good laugh, a political laugh in a sense, is something where I see the possibility for change as well. That's one of the finest examples of the absurd that we are experiencing. So I think this is where I'll stop now. And I'll give it up to Aga, and if you have any questions, please just comment in the comment section. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Katerina. Now we'll hear from Isabella Shields, who is one of the directors and curators at 16 Nicholson Street, and is also a PhD student in literature at University of Edinburgh, studying trauma theory and contemporary women's autofiction. She will talk about the intersection of art and research in As a Pile of Ash, and Katerina's publication, Martyrdom, Body, State, Manifesting Power, the latter of which she worked on as editor. So here you go.
Thank you so much, Aga, and thanks, Katerina. In discussing art and research in the context of this exhibition, I thought it'd be good to start just by saying that one of the reasons I became a curator is that art is often an active research project. I like that the temporary conclusion of that research exists in its materialization in installations, performances, and publication, and that in good artwork, these things direct everyone involved further out while acting as a self-portrait for the artist. Working on the publication as editor with Katerina and reading her work in contemporary Russian politics was hugely enlightening to me. Beyond the BBC adaptation of War and Peace, my knowledge of Dostoevsky was slim before I started working on the publication, and admittedly, so was my awareness of the contemporary Russian political situation. Russia seemed like an almost historical place, which is partly because of my approach to being quite bound up in studying it. My relationship to Russia was through constructivism, some 19th century Russian literature, and the Cold War, through my partner Harlan's interest in Soviet science fiction, and through occasional engagement with Russian cinema. In the West, I think this remoteness also lends itself to a sense that Russia is a frightening political power, divorced from us and kind of frozen in time, the time of the Cold War, which it obviously absolutely isn't. Katerina's exhibition publication did an incredible job at proving that by demonstrating that the history we think of as being remote from us is foundational to the apparatus of contemporary social control. Editing the publication and supposedly disciplining a multidisciplinary textual work was like a curatorial project because it had to take intelligibility, positioning, accessibility, pace, etc. into account. In working with Katerina, we were working with Russian and Dutch in translation and with English. One of the tasks in working with this text was retaining Katerina's voice while maneuvering the text out of Russian and Dutch syntax, which is very different from English sentence structure. Similarly, there are moments throughout the text where the spelling of words changes from Cyrillic to the Dutch translation of that word and then to the Romanization. There were points where I wanted to leave that as it was and points where I wanted to be consistent, i.e. with the spelling of Fyodor Dostoevsky with a Y-O rather than Fedor, and Semyonovsky Platz rather than Semenovsky with an IY at the end, which is the Dutch spelling. As an English speaker, the editing process has to be a balancing act. The two most important things in that process are clarity and voice. And as with any Western, non-Western collaboration, the threat of anglicizing and Romanizing language being a pseudo-colonial exercise is very present. Apart from that, the work isn't exclusively an academic text, and that's the kind of work that I've edited most in my capacity as a PhD student. The kind of rigor required for that is different from the kind of rigor required for this. The form and language in marshaled and body state creates different linguistic needs, and so does the emotional capacity of this work in comparison to work that's more exclusively analytical. The publication and the exhibition exists as a collection of research and historical accounts, a translation, a reflective work, as political criticism, apography, poetry, prose, art writing, and creative nonfiction. This meant the grammatical and tonal demands of each of those practices were involved in the editing process, which is what made the process so exciting. There are also numerous voices involved in the exhibition and publication themselves. Katerina's, Dostoevsky's voice in both fiction and correspondence, Baron A. Rangel's, Didi Akrashimov's, Michel Foucault's, and Aga and Nell's creative voices. Katerina is equally multivocal in this project as the art and theatrical narrator, historian, academic, creative writer, and as equivocator of the feeling immediately before death. As I mentioned earlier, retaining the author's voice while editing work is crucial. It's very obvious from the exhibition itself and from the publication that Katerina is extremely intelligent and her voice is unique. When editing the publication, I was thinking a lot about how its multiplicity works in terms of speaking for and speaking with people in the context of censorship. In my academic work, I'm reading contemporary women's autofiction and autotheory as existential works on the female experience of violence and considering autobiographical writing as something both liberating and trapping. In Katerina's own writing, she communicates these themes as Dostoevsky himself works with them, while relating the scenario of the fake trial as a Kafkaesque nightmare and as a present danger. The significance of this multiplicity of voice, language, historical content, and form emphasizes the universal nature of these experiences despite their specificities and the multitudes that their representation holds. The interactions between the exhibition and the publication are so clear because the entire project is the materialization of Katerina's deep and intensive research. Some of my favorite elements are the panels that the viewer has to lean through because of that sense of vulnerability and debasement that comes from having to bend over to act as a witness and become complicit in the exercise of power. The hyperreal bodily colours of the panels, which are juicy ruby and bright red from B&Q, emphasise the objection that the voyeurism of capital punishment generates for everyone who is involved at every level. The punishers, the punished, and the audience, who stand between the punishers and the punished. That and the soil and the execution stage are particularly strong points of conjunction with the publication for me. In my reading of it, the soil represents the intersection of life or the organism and a sense of potential, as well as a funereal because of the Orthodox Christianity Katerina discusses in the chapter, the origins of martyrdom in Russia, and that she briefly discussed there, and the sense of the universal that comes from just seeing soil in its texture, smell, and symbolism. Another significant point of connection between the exhibition and the publication are the performances, the first of which took place in the gallery and is now posted on our Instagram, and 5 minutes 0 seconds, the performance at Johnstone Square in Glasgow Green, which is within the walkthrough. And they both involve correspondence pieces. The first performance was so important because it let the viewer hear the letters, dear body, dear beholder, dear brother, and dear friends, as opposed to reading them. That difference is so important because of what that means in terms of the reader's ability to project onto these words and internalize them in comparison to the spectatorial experience. 5 minutes 0 seconds also involves correspondence from V.G. Belinsky to N.B. Gogol about censorship and hypocrisy. And I think correspondence is such an important form and writing style for this exhibition and publication because it's intimate, but it also emphasizes the need for communication and the privileging of voice itself. This filming also acted as a kind of correspondence in itself because Aga worked with Katerina remotely through video call, which I know Aga will discuss later on. The final pre-execution text, Dear Friends, isn't included in the digital publication, but it's so evocative as a piece of writing because it feels deeply personal and global. Everything that's gone into as a pile of ash is a process of visualization, internalization, and embodiment. And I think Aga and Katerina's 360 filming of the VR performance is such a testament to that in Glasgow's most notorious hanging place. When we look back at the last week, state-sanctioned violence is being spotlit, and the sheer volume of it has meant that it's felt personal in many ways. Most women certainly have seen themselves in the coverage of Sarah Everard's murder, the resultant police brutality and silencing legislation, and the anniversary of the police killing of Breonna Taylor, not to mention the RAF assault or the murder of 10 Asian American women in Atlanta. The reason Katerina's work is so vital and so rich is that it instigates this internalization of the anguish and enlightenment before death, but then leaves the viewer and the reader with the question of what's next. It's a really live piece of work, and immediacy is so central to it because these threats aren't exclusively historical or remote. The vitality Katerina's work communicates is so bound up in questions of consequence, in questions of what it means to have seen incidents of gross injustice for the individual and for society. My experience is not the same or comparable to Russian women's or the Russian queer community, but the presumption of any sense of freedom being corrupted and diminished globally is very real. The other side of that is the sense that the consequences for violent behaviour are also being diminished and that the safety of violent individuals is consistently being upheld. In the publication, Katerina discusses examples of political martyrdom in contemporary Russia in the cases of the Network Group, Julia Tsvetkova, and Irina Slavina. In discussing these instances and gross injustices, the work also witnesses in a different way, an active way, because it involves remembrance and an acknowledgement of the lives compromised and lost because of a refusal to be complicit. This sense of heaping personal, political, and historical information is as agitating as it is invigorating. The most impressive part of Katerina's work, to me, is how it creates this sense of things snowballing while positioning you as both the snowball and the snow being lifted by it. I'd just like to conclude with a quote from Arcadian Boris Strugatsky's Roadside Picnic that I think reflects the nature of art, research, and activism. All these conversations had left a certain sediment in his soul, and he didn't know what it was. It wasn't dissolving with time, but instead kept accumulating and accumulating. Thank you, that's me.
Thanks so much, Isabella. And now we'll hear from Nell Cardozo, co-director and curator at 6 Nicholson Street, who has contributed to the digital and print publications for this exhibition. And she's going to read and contextualize her poem, The Three Graces. Over to you.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me, and it's really exciting to get a chance to kind of unpack how I wrote the poem and to read it to everyone here. So I'm going to start with just reading the poem, The Three Graces, which is part of Katerina's publication that everyone's been discussing, and then I'll just talk through some of the ideas that inspired the poem and how they connect to the other themes that we've been discussing as well. The Three Graces. I saw these trees many times while driving from Minsk to Brest. Only during early foggy spring, they look such exceptionally graphical and irresistible that it wasn't possible to pass by without stopping. I met these three graces outside the National Gallery. They stand alive in red and white. It wasn't possible to see without asking. They ask about Canova, about the white marble three, about the answer, a woman will collapse, poor fellow. How grace becomes an act of resilience. I thought about naming and knowing, name your enemy and therefore know them. About sculpting as change that then becomes solidified. The process of change, soft, hard, soft. Is this a particularly womanly process? The push and pull between change and fixity in the labor of nation building. I thought about sculpture, about memorial, about strength and resistance and change, about Thalia, bloom, Algaia, splendor, Euphrosyne, joyfulness. Bloom, as in those held at the crest of the wave. Grace, the dance of boot on body. Joyfulness, a body moving together. Soft bodies, cast your eyes on these, not marble. Change slide. So this poem was inspired by three people I met protesting outside in the streets of Edinburgh and in the colours of the Belarusian flag, red and white. They were protesting the undemocratic election in August last year and the continued authoritarian rule of Lukashenko, which has carried on since 1994, as long as I've been alive. They asked me about the Three Graces, which is a sculpture in our collection shared with the National Galleries in London, by Canova, that you can see here pictured. And they were particularly interested in this because it's become a sort of moniker. It's an image that's really tied to the cause of the protest movement in Belarus. They told me about three female leaders of the opposition parties that had joined together, Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya, Veronika Zhepkalo, and Maria Kolesnikova. They were these three leaders, and they were dubbed the Three Graces in a sort of sarcastic and derogatory way by the right-wing press, with typically misogynistic responses to their collaboration, such as the regime sucks so bad that even a housewife could become president. And by other politicians, consider that Lukashenko said the line from the poem, "A woman will collapse, poor fellow," when referring to the struggle of protecting the constitution. But somehow, the opposition has managed to co-opt this image of the Three Graces as a positive banner to rally under, which seemed quite incongruous to me. I was interested in what this marble sculpture represents and how a classical allegory and a neoclassical sculpture has captured the imagination of a movement from a completely removed time and place. This is potentially because women have been so important in this protest movement in Belarus, whether that be in the front lines or organizing the resistance in a really unprecedented way. Organizations such as the Belarusian Organization of Working Women and others have together strategized tactics. Some of these include standing at the front line of protests to protect their male counterparts from violence from the police. The idea being that, like, ideologically it would be harder for these police and soldiers to attack women. It hasn't been 100% successful, and there have been lots of counts of women being tortured in detention after these protests as well. But they have been quite successful in some ways. And they've also developed symbolic techniques such as standing with flowers in an act of peaceful protest. And this is referenced in the poem in the line, "Bloom as in crest of a wave." In Belarus, as in everywhere, the pandemic has exposed major fault lines in society. And part of the main reason women have been activated politically and the protests themselves were triggered was the denial and mishandling of the pandemic. Belarus is the only country in Europe, apart from Sweden, that did not impose a national lockdown. This, of course, is a feminist issue, as we've seen here in the UK. The low-paid, unskilled jobs, or more crucially, those on the front line of health and social care work, are carried out disproportionately by minorities and women, respectively. In Belarus, more than 80% of the second group is constituted by women. And these are obviously a group that's been hardest hit by the economic and health impacts of the crisis. Now, the Three Graces themselves in mythology are Thalia, who represents youth, beauty, bloom, and festivities, Euphrosyne, who represents good cheer, mirth, joyfulness, and Algaia, who represents beauty, splendor, and elegance. And I was interested in how these allegorical sort of womanly qualities that seem incompatible with the language of or reality of protest had taken on a new mantle, a fierce mantle, and have been repurposed for a resistance movement. There's an interesting tension at play between these typically female, read weak or soft qualities and the violence of authoritarianism. There's this push and pull between hard and soft, which I wanted to present at play in the Three Graces poem. It's reflected in lines like the dance of boot on body. And this is much like the art of sculpture itself. When writing the Three Graces, these are things that were floating around and the strands that we're trying to pull together. I was thinking about protest, reshaping, and the tension between fixity and change, represented by sculptures like Canova's The Three Graces. History is often portrayed as fixed, but protests work with the pliable matter of history, the present itself. They're predicated on the tension between what has been and what could be. And to circle back to the Three Graces, this is also the function they perform as a symbol. By using a symbol, we reference both what has been and what could be. This is what makes it a very powerful force. Change slide. What struck me is the fact that images can be uprooted from their contexts, from their field of reference, and quickly adopt new symbolic meanings. The first stanza of the poem cites an amateur photographer's description of three trees, which he titled The Three Graces, and I like that this showed a complete removal from context. Symbols like the Three Graces transcend history, and I think this is really important within struggles for change because it points to history as an act of leaving and returning more than anything else. Change slide. And to round off, I'll point out the relief of them on the arch at Jocelyn Square, the site on Glasgow Green where we filmed Kat's performance. The function they perform here is clearly to call to the classical period and ideas of justice and civilization, although this points to a darker performative power and the mechanisms at play there. This was, after all, a site for public execution. And it's interesting to see this in comparison to the more nuanced use of the Three Graces symbol by the opposition movement in Belarus. Where will the Three Graces next crop up? What will they be used as a vessel for? It's in their nature that they won't be tied forever to these three women from Belarus and will continue to be repurposed. Thank you.
Hello again. So thanks a lot, Nell. And now we'll hear from our guest speaker, Oksana Zapletina from St. Petersburg, Russia. She's a sociologist and psychologist, and we'll talk about the fear of militarization and demonstration of power. Here you go, Oksana.
Okay, thank you, Aga. Hello, everyone. I'm sorry. My name is Oksana. Today, I would like to tell you about fear of militarization and demonstration of power. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I'm from Russia. I live in St. Petersburg. I'm a PhD student in psychology, and I work in a Montessori kindergarten as a senior Montessori teacher. Also, I have a bachelor's and master's degree in sociology, I'm sorry. I would like to emphasize that I'm going to describe my personal opinion and I don't impose your perceptions here. So we have two pictures here, and you can see the drawing that demonstrates Petra Chavists on the Semyonovsky Platz on the left, and the photo on the right was made in January during the protests in St. Petersburg. The most exciting thing is that this is the same place. But now the Semyonovsky Platz is called Pionierskaya Square. I think that is extremely symbolic. Despite this fact, I believe that it's not quite right to compare these two events for a few reasons. So First, according to the historical data, we know that execution of Petra Chavists was well planned, unlike the spontaneous actions that different authorities and political actors made during the last protests in Russia. This conclusion is based on the diverse situations that were announced in the news. For example, the police had detained people in a brutal manner, and after a few hours, they realized that all of the paddy wagons were occupied. In the end, the city bus came for the detained people. Secondly, we can see that a lot of different social groups are included in current political events. And today it's not a small group of high educated people, it's a huge amount of citizens with different backgrounds, socioeconomic statuses, and individual concerns. For example, I saw in the news how one old woman told the reporter that she is here because she worries about her grandchildren's future. I think it's so cool. Finally, I think that political views among Russian people are polarized. There is no agenda to be for or against, to love Navalny or not. Navalny is the most popular positionist in Russia. By the way, he is in prison now. Sorry. The next point is about the militarization of consciousness. I think that this process takes a lot of time and a lot of money from government. First of all, we don't have the opportunity to get different opinions about some social and political problems from our federal channels because of innocent propaganda. If we are not talking about the news, there are a lot of TV shows, new films that are related with militarization. It imposes that idea how we should perceive different strong structures. Moreover, political debates look like a theater with people that are not really included in the current agenda. Besides a cult of militarization, we face an external enemy cult that blocks culture exchange, developing tolerance and respect for other cultures. It's an existing joke that the West is rotten. I don't think so, but there are a lot of people that really do. According to this reality, we cannot avoid long-term consequences. This picture illustrates the time when Moses led people through the desert. And for me, it's a good metaphor for meaningful social changes. I suppose that people will have a fear of state aggression that could be related to mistrust. Moreover, we observe the justification of violence. I mean, that sense when you are always ready to protect your borders, even if nobody wants to cross them. I'm worried about this because I work with children and I can see how the environment affects them. But we have some good news too. And it's probably the best thing that we can see here. New social institutes have appeared because of these current political events. First, there are non-profit organizations that provides pro bono legal aid to people that were arrested in the protests. I believe that these organizations have highly raised the level of human rights awareness among people. And you can see some of them below the slide. There are Apologia Pro, Apologia, Over the Info, And secondly, we have few independent internet media, like Media Zona. You can see it below the slide. This is a play of words because the zone in Russian zona has two meanings, area and jail. So this media overwatches the lives of political and criminal prisoners in Russia and tries to protect the prisoners from the aggression of the authorities. Finally, of the level of grassroots solidarity has become higher. People unite around common problems like recycling or changing the landscape. All this in general shows that something is happening and we are probably on a verge of some important changes in the Russian society. And the last slide, yes. So thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate this chance to talk about my country. Thank you, Katerina and 16 Nicholson Street. You're doing an amazing job. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Oksana. That was brilliant, and you completely blew my mind by saying that zone means both jail and an area, because that just absolutely changed my reading of Tarkovsky's Stalker. I was just like, wow. Right, so now we will proceed to the final stage of our event, which is basically panel discussion and Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to share them in the chat. Otherwise, I will also remind everyone that you are very warmly invited to see the virtual show on our website. And yeah, I will start with the first question. Let me see. I think I'll turn it a little bit on its head because I feel like the question I was supposed to start with is not appropriate anymore. So I'll start with another one. That's to you, Katerina. So as an artist working internationally, how does making art in the public realm, both online and offline, impact your practice?
Yeah, we discussed this quite a bit behind the scenes, and it's still not an easy question to answer, because indeed what we are talking about is a complete change in what digital, the free internet used to be a couple of years ago and what is coming to be right now. And my position here is maybe even problematic, definitely not black and white in that sense. I am, of course, an artist. I am a citizen of Russia, but I'm also a citizen of Netherlands. I've been living here on and off for 10 years, and I was lucky enough to live in Scotland for a year. So I am detached from the political reality in Russia. And that said, the exhibition that is on and offline in 16 Nicholson right now would not be at any way possible was it directed to a Russian audience. This is simply not a reality anymore in a country where censorship has entered social media. You can go and have quite real physical repercussions of your social media activity. You could be prosecuted for saved imagery in your private folder on Russian social media. This is something that we were joking about 5 years from now, and it is happening as we speak. And I hate demonizing Russia, and I'm always a big advocate for state versus people. And that's, I think, a big part of what Oksana was describing. And indeed, we have civil society on the rise, social self-awareness on the rise, and the diverse communities, they are not afraid, they are acting, while 20 years ago, they could have been just successfully, peacefully existing in the shadows, which is not acceptable as well. So what we are dealing with is a break. There is no synchronicity between what's happening online and the offline. And unfortunately, Russia for sure has stepped into future and past at the same time. Past in sense of censorship and watching behind your back, and future in terms of next level of social awareness. And my role here I see as given a, I wouldn't say platform, but a moment of connecting the two worlds, and also opening discussion almost as a cautionary tale for what's happening when progressively right-wing, more and more right-wing government is taking reign. And I think the parallel with what's happening with police violence and legal support for police violence in UK nowadays is very strong. We were having a very similar law made in the beginning of the pandemic. And we can talk more and more about, yeah, that break from digital to physical. And I don't think there would be an exact conclusion to it just yet. All I can say is that networks of cooperation are also happening person to person. We have this brilliant saying, address radio, which is basically when information is spreading from person to person. So gossip as an alternative, but gossip in the most positive way. And it's direct interactions from people to people, from person to person in solidarity. And this is where I see the future, where digital sphere is getting easier restricted day by day. And of course, I can speak about direct government interaction in cases of Russia, but we can also speak about corporation control of the big media that run social media, like Facebook, Twitter, etc.
I remember us talking about this a while ago, and I'm bringing it back down to the streets and physical interaction level. I remember us talking about trying to do intervention art on the street in our home countries. I'm from Poland. So my experience is that 10 years ago, I was feeling quite free to, or at least maybe I wasn't feeling afraid wearing a rainbow flag on my patch as a sticker or whatever. And right now, that just having a little pin gives me an anxiety and make changes the way I move around the city. And then Katerina, you were talking about how you were just executing some sort of university or art academy task where you had to intervene, make an intervention piece on the street. And you had a little poster that said, "Look up." What did it say?
Lift your eyes from the ground. It was an nonsense
Lift your
poster,
eyes from the ground.
making not like a non-statement, which I still couldn't do.
Yeah. And that was too radical to show. That was so, even though no one told you not to go out in the street and show it, you were still too afraid to do that. And that's just kind of the result of the society and how we use the public space, and what has dominated, what kind of attitude has dominated the public space. So that kind of leads me to another question, which is about the use of public space. And we saw Oksana juxtaposing the Semyovsky Platz as a place of execution, as well as a place of public demonstrations that happened just last year and throughout the last year. So yes, I'm just kind of opening question about how do we use the public space as a forum for civic justice, and can art be a support for that? Can it be an effective support for that? Like, what do you think? Maybe that question is to you, Oksana. Mm-hmm. How do you see that?
Okay, thank you for this question. Yes, okay. And I think that we were talking about contradiction between public execution and public demonstration. And I think that public demonstration, of course, have some crucial differences, because it provides by people, and during the public demonstration, in current public demonstrations in Russia, we saw a lot of solidarity and respect from people that went outside. And of course, I think that public demonstration provides, if I can say it, different society, because when you can feel, when you can understand that you can influence some events, you can influence the decisions of government, you can feel safe. You can be, I don't know, you can stay here. Because when you see some public executions, as we have now, when people go to prison and have a lot of problems now, and non-profit organizations, as I mentioned before, help them. And it's really complicated. And I think that some consequences of this can be related with fear of, like in general, when you don't want to live here, you don't grow up children here, you just can't expect what is your future, because it's unpredictable. Mm-hmm. And I think that art makes really crucial thing. I think art is like a bridge between different opinions, and art is not pushing you to have some certain opinion. Yes, and it's a good place for discussion. But you know, in Russia, it's complicated too, because a lot of artists have a problem because of their work, and it's really hard to make art here, political art.
There's this organization that helps artists from Belarus, and I suppose from Russia as well, to the blacklisted artists to earn money from abroad, because otherwise their accounts would be closed. So we've tried to collaborate before, but yeah, I find that very interesting as well, that I suppose it's really hard to make art, but at the same time, art has also historically been used to mold people's opinions in a certain way. which is one of its powers as well. So and concerning the historical context, about every city has its execution space, and we went on quite an exciting journey of researching all the places where anyone has ever been executed in Glasgow. And we chose the Johnstone Square in Glasgow Green Park, which is probably because of its architectural qualities. But Isabella, would you like to tell us something more about Johnstone Square and the history surrounding it?
So I kind of only came across Jocelyn Arch, the whole thing, because of a murder tour that my friend Maddie booked me on in like 2015. Like I think I, like every other like woman in the world at that point, was like listening to a lot of true crime podcasts. Like my work for like uni and all that kind of stuff for my masters was kind of going to be geared towards like Maggie Nelson's work and like how to speak for like the dead, how to speak for like and how to like channel that voice, I suppose. So Maddie obviously booked me on a really like hokey pokey murder tour with a guy who was dressed as like some kind of out of no time period, basically. Guy in a cape with a big hat, and he took us around like all these places where like the ghosts of Glasgow are, and like there were murders here, there were murders there, and like Jocelyn Arch was the place that was like the most sort of prolific hanging square. And kind of when we were just talking about where to have the other performance, like that was kind of the place that sprang to mind, because not only did he make it a really kind of spectacular thing in his cape and his little hat, but it is like such an accessible place, I think. And I think it's really interesting when we think about staging the performances, staging violence, staging executions, and staging like state-sanctioned killings. To have them in such open spaces, to have the priority for them being that they are visible more than anything else in these kind of events. And like, I just think that's really interesting in how we think about retribution and punishment and kind of what that means, which I guess is what the exhibition is about, and the invitation too.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, like parks being the only public meeting space at the currently made it a very clear choice. And I think Glasgow Green has quite a lot of attendance, which was a problem during filming. So I think I have one more question, and that is a question to Nell. Would you like to say something more about like how you think your poem contextualizes and reflects Katerina's work and the topics?
Well, when I was kind of trying to think of something because we've unpacked so much about Katerina's work and there are so many aspects that we could talk about, I was trying to think of something that really kind of defined the essence of this piece as a pile of ash for me. And it was this idea of this kind of liminal space between like living and dying that Dostoevsky talks about. And he talks about like the quote from the letter, "Dear brother," is the moment of a dedicated contemplation of how to be human, but if I must, but moreover the understanding of me having a place in the world. And I thought that this was like a really interesting way of boiling down that, obviously in the moment between life and death is something that's so universal, like everybody will have to experience that, but it's also something that's enforced by the threat and the fear of violence. So it's something that like is really come to the forefront of people's minds when they're afraid of police brutality or state brutality. And it's a kind of interesting mechanism because, you know, we're talking about public spaces and those are the kind of places where you think about yourself as part of a group, and that's why they're really important for the forming of like a nation. That's why sculptures are there, that's why people gather there. But I think the purpose of this kind of capital punishment, or the fear of capital punishment or violence, is to make you feel alone, to make you feel solo, to make you feel afraid, and that kind of separates you from the group. And like, yeah, so basically then I was thinking about what the nature of this tension and how it affects protest. And when I was thinking about Belarus, I was also thinking about this tension that I spoke about in the poem between kind of like people as an individual and people as a group, but also about history and the notion of change, but also repetition, and how that kind of enacts in public spaces and through public icons and monuments and sculptures and things like that. So it was really kind of just unpacking this very small moment. That's something that obviously Kat unpacks in a completely different way, but I was kind of drawn to that phrase in particular.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your answer. It was very interesting and comprehensive. And I also remember us talking about that the relief on the Johnstone Square Arch, it's there for a reason, and that's probably because some colonial big lord decided to kind of pardon himself and justify his actions by erecting that art, like big arch with the three graces.
And like it's interesting that you say that, because there's also a big like a monument, like a column in the middle of Glasgow Green, and people, the kind of like colloquial term that people knew, if you're going to be hanged, people would say you'll die facing the monument, and people were deliberately positioned in the archway so that they would face the monument, which is, I think it's a Nelson monument. But it's just a very interesting that all of these things that you see in Glasgow, but you know, they're in every city, these sites of performance and like and proving your power by like proving that you can take someone's life while they're looking at an emblem of your power. It's that's also interesting, the staging of that.
That's the splendor and grace.
Yeah.
So we have a comment from John. So in Belarus, it seems Lukashenko is painfully analog and doesn't really understand the internet. In that sense, Bakhtin's carnival is a virtual as well as physical one. Been some wonderful art activist things too. And here's the link to Alexandra Ivanova in St. Petersburg. Thanks a lot.
I'll comment on that. It's Lukashenko is indeed from a different epoch. Being a close friend of Putin and a closest ally, he instantly got help in the form of Russian media team. So best propaganda specialists instantly were flown to Belarus, and national television changed instantly. So from a mere state of panic and confusion and showing the rioting crowds, it instantly switched to the very well-known Russian absurdity. And I'm obsessed with Russian political technology, and I have background in political studies before I dropped out because it was terrible. Russian politics is performative. It's not a little metaphor that I'm using. Big Russian technologists have studied theater, and the power of the symbol is something that, as well as power of text, so the power of metaphor, written or visual, in that sense is so dominant and used, you would think, rather wisely, but just like in case of Petra Chavists, it creates this state projecting itself onto people, projecting its power onto people, creates a ripple effect, but not necessarily the kind you would wish. So the case of Decembrists and Petra Chavists turned against the regime eventually, if the execution and the mock execution 20 years later with a different group did not happen, the common people would not have found out about them and their ideas. And by framing them as political martyrs, that they have turned those people into symbols of change. Of course, soon enough, we had a source freed, but soon after that, the revolution was being prepared and was happening, the October events. And same things are happening here. The case of Navalny as the leader of opposition is very clear here. We don't all agree with his position. He is known to have made nationalistic statement and quite negative statements against immigrants in Russia, but just because he is now framed to be a martyr, his work for establishing a civil society in Russia has been highlighted, and more people have found out about this particular aspect of his work than ever before. And that kind of progress would not be happening without symbolism and the power of text. And that's something that during my own research and working with Aga, Isabella, and Nell, we continuously were coming across. We would have not known so much about the Chavists was there no text. And if the execution itself wasn't so obscenely over the top carnival circus like, and same things are happening with contemporary politics. If it wasn't so absurd and so symbolic, it would be way less noticeable. And I'm happy that this deep red thread that is going through Russian culture, that is literature and the power of a metaphor, is something that can keep the society together. This is something we can always fall back to, and even if momentarily, also of course based on severe propaganda. We're not talking about human rights as we're talking about survival, but having this red thread of symbolism, humor, wit, and connectivity through literature gives hope for resistance.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting comment about the use of humor in resistance and by the oppressed groups. And I thought that kind of bridged, did an interesting bridge between what Isabella was talking about in terms of like linguistics and translating and finding a common ground, or not finding it because of the Anglicization. Okay, I'm butchering this, but you know what I mean. So yeah, I think, do we have any more questions? Here's one from Octavia. Could you comment on how much you think the West has driven the Russian state to the right? For example, NATO expansion in the 90s. Would you care to comment on that, Katerina or Oksana? Don't know if you have the...
Having a little think, because of course it's a bit more of it's a complex issue. What has driven us to the right was extreme corruption in the first place, was the privatization of national property, which has created oligarchs and the system that Putin and the other leading elite are part of. But what I could maybe see links with is what Oksana was mentioning, the extreme militarization of society that actually goes hand in hand with establishing binary roles for the children. So strong boys defenders and mother figure girls. That's what we are made to choose from. But that in the same time is going with the narrative of a foreign intruder. So that idea of NATO is expanding, but that has changed to there are infiltrators in Russia. There is the enemy. So everyone is becoming the enemy. If that's, Octavia, if that is giving you an answer at all, I guess it's the core would be the crazy will of those who came to power and established it with intense corrupt links, wanting to find ways to stay longer and therefore creating two enemies, which are the West and the queer community, unfortunately. And that also goes with the rise of Christianity again. We were a secular state for 60 years in the 90s. Religion was not a big thing, and the multiplicity of religions was highly accepted. And now more and more Christian agendas being pushed together with the traditional family values, as they are called in Russia, and nationalism in the sense of dividing what's domestic, what's Russian from the rest of the world, which is seen portrayed as an enemy.
I think it sounds very interesting how all these like narratives arise and how they're executed, because I mean, the way we're talking, it kind of seems like there's a committee of like theater directors that's reporting to the Russian Facebook or whatnot, and then they just like orchestrate this entire play. But obviously that's probably not how it is. But one striking thing that I've also heard, I think it was Oksana who said that the new organizations are raising human rights awareness, and that's what's helping. And for me, that sounded quite striking, because it's not it. So it kind of means that it's about not realizing that your rights are violated, not realizing you could have more rights, because it's just about that. Apparently, those organizations are helping to raise awareness. So that's what's lacking. And so when the awareness is there are protests. But I mean, I don't know if you get what I'm driving at. It just feels like the narrative of.
Yeah, you finish that, and then I'll just say what I was going to say afterwards.
I was just saying that I feel like the narrative is so strong. The overarching narrative that Katerina was talking about is so strong that what's lacking is in fact the awareness of human rights, because you wouldn't even imagine you could have them.
Yeah, like when I was researching a lot about Belarus and about why the protests came, and they really erupted, and it was such a strong protest movement in a way that didn't have a precedent. You know, we have a really strong culture of protest movements, but it was like this kind of massive popular surge was very, very very rare. And they were saying that basically it was really, really down to the amount of violence and brutality that was carried out against the protesters, that it was like really one of the main factors that had made people protest more, was just this idea that, you know, we weren't protesting because we didn't realize there was anything wrong, but as soon as we protested and this was the reaction, that's made them realize that this, you know, there's a hard limit to what they're allowed to do, and when they try and cross that, then they're met with violence. And I think that's really like similar to what you're saying, Aga. It's this idea of being in the dark until there's some event or some precedent, or like Kat was saying, some martyr, an example made that makes you question what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do by those in command.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Nell. Does anyone have any more questions? The floor is open. I'm just gonna go through my notes. I think I've run out. Okay, I mean, in this case, thank you so much for participating in our first ever webinar. And please do go to our website and have a look at the walkthrough. It's been lovely having everyone, and thanks so much to all the speakers, and thank you to Kerr for managing this webinar, and yeah, thank you for the questions. Yeah, see you sometime soon, hopefully in April when we reopen. Right.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Aga.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.